All right, so before we talk about CSS grids, I want to talk about how grids are used in design. Okay, this is a general design concept. This is not specific to web development. The concept of using grids comes up in, print layouts, poster design, all sorts of things. Okay, so I want to talk about these concepts, and then we're going to talk about how they apply in CSS. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to talk about alignment. Okay, we talked about alignment a little bit when we did text align, but alignment is this placement of visual items so they line up in a composition. Okay, so in design, and when I say design, I mean like just general design, we use alignment to organize elements, to group elements, to create what's called balance, create what's called structure, to create connection between elements. So typically this is referred to as either edge alignment or center alignment. Edge alignment is when the edges of something meet up. So this is vertical. The top edges lining up for all of these pieces of text. This is where all the bottom line up. There's like this invisible line. It can also be on the left side or on the right side. This is how we see text normally, where typically there's what's called a flush side, or a side where all the text will line up, and the other side, which is typically referred to as the ragged side. Or we could set things so that they're centered, either centered vertically or centered horizontally. So a lot of designs will have this kind of alignment. Okay, so this is an example of a centered aligned design. So in other words, like if you look at least just the text here, maybe not the literal elements, you can see that it's like the text is kind of centered, where it's like half on this side, half on that side, right? So it's like this is centered. This is kind of halfway through this little, acorn element here, right? Here's another example where it's like the design is like this is sort of an imaginary line, and then it's like half on this side, half on this side, half on this side, half on that side, half on this side, half on that side. Okay, this is a centered piece or centered alignment design. Even things that may not necessarily seem centered, like here, because you have this big sort of graphic image that isn't necessarily centered. The text itself is kind of centered. So if you kind of look at this here, it's like here and then there, and then here and there, text over here, text over there, right? So it's kind of centered as a design in terms of alignment. Why do we want to have this good or bad alignment? Well, good alignment creates a sense of formality, it creates a sense of trust and elegance. Good alignment is typically invisible, meaning we don't notice it. It doesn't have to be a literal line. This is something where things line up and we sort of like the view of it. Also, kind of going conversely, if something is badly aligned, we notice it and it stands out, and that's not always a good thing. Okay, so, oops. I don't know why this didn't work, but anyway, here, let me show. I don't know why it's, sometimes when I download things, it comes through awkwardly. I don't know why. Anyway, here in this design, let's look at the thing on here. It's like this design feels off, right? Let me just, now why does it feel off? Well, it's because that my items here are not quite lining up to each other. So it's like, we would kind of like to see, we kind of want this to be sort of the left side, because this is where most of it is kind of hitting. But this text here isn't quite matching up to that. And it's not even matching up to this either. So it's not matching up to either. We also have this, and then like this is indented, and then like this doesn't even seem like it's centered. It's just kind of like each has its own starting place. This is not really matching up to anything. So it's like the alignment is all off. Nothing is really squaring away to anything. You know what I mean? And that just makes the general design feel kind of awkward. Same thing here. I found this online where it's like, there's a lot of things here. It's like, this has this line, right? The side edge of this R is literally creating this line, but this doesn't really match up to it, let alone, I'm not even going to get into fonts yet. But just even in terms of alignment, this kind of feels better if this was kind of over here. these don't really end well either. It's like this kind of ends at one line, this ends at another, this ends at a third. So it's like none of these are really kind of matching up evenly. It's okay to not necessarily keep things in aligned, to keep things aligned, as long as you understand why you're doing it. So here in this particular design, all of these are flush or aligned to the left. And so thus this element is standing out because it's not. Now that's okay. What this really does is it puts emphasis or contrast on this item here. Sometimes things are a little bit more, there is alignment, it's just hidden a little bit. So here it's like, even though this text starts here, it actually kind of this and this part match up actually. Same thing over here. Okay. So a lot of times, like I said, we like things that kind of line up, which is why we typically like grids. So it's like this line matches up with this line, which matches up with this line. So it feels very formal. Everything feels very like there's a cohesiveness to it. There's a unity, as we would say, in terms of design. You know, that's just the rows, so to speak. So it's like, well, you also have these lines kind of matching up here, and then they match up to this line, and they match up to this line. I can't draw my lines straight, but you know, you get what I'm trying to say, right? You can see this in a lot of ways. This is Photoshop, so it's like this is an application, but you can see how it's like all of my panels are kind of lining up here, right? Whether it's the adjustments, the layer, or this color, they all kind of align here. Or in the, you know, you got these tools, right? And it's like here, this tool, all of the icons kind of align to the left there, and all the text kind of aligns here, right? That makes it seem, you know, a lot more formal. Once again, there's an alignment or sort of a grid. Everything is kind of, oops. I draw this vertical, you know, my lines are not perfectly straight, but hopefully you can kind of see. Everything's kind of aligning to the left here. Okay, even this line is kind of matching up with like the left, the right side of this, you know, QR code. So we use grids. Okay, grids are made up of alignments. Here, this is a website for a particular, I think it was like a design firm. And it's like, it feels very, everything feels nice. It feels comfortable, and it's because of the grid. So it's like, you know, this is aligned to this, which is aligned to that. Everything kind of starts nicely, right? There's all these, this is, in terms of a grid, we would call this a row, and this is another row, and this is a third row. We would then call this a column. You know, this is a column, this is a column, this is a column, this is a column. Here's another example, a little more intricate, but same idea of a grid, where it's like, okay, this is, you know, an alignment, it matches up with that. This creates one tall row, but then these kind of align to each other. This is a row, you know, this is another row, and sort of divided into these different columns here. You know, once again, this is like design is like, this is a row, this is a really tall row, but it's like column, 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 column. Or even something like Pinterest, which it doesn't have exact rows, but basically it's a bunch of columns. It's like column, 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 and then each one is sort of broken into these parts here. You can even use grids to show emphasis by when you have things that line up in a grid and then you deliberately break that grid, it brings emphasis on something because it's seen as being off. So it can, people can sort of break that to kind of draw attention to something. Same thing's kind of going on here where there's kind of this grid here with the text, but then this kind of breaks that by not conforming to that sort of alignment here. Okay. All right, so that's grids as a whole in just design terms. Now you could be doing this in any kind of graphic design program. Let's talk about grids in the context of HTML and CSS. The way you should think about grids in HTML, CSS is think about it like an Excel spreadsheet. Okay, let's imagine I have this Google spreadsheet, which is the same as an Excel, essentially. It's tabular data. Let's say I'm just going to put in some content. Okay, cell 1, cell 2, cell 3, cell 4, cell 5, cell 6, cell 7, cell 8, cell 9. Okay. So, part of my layout is, well, there's a certain distance between this text and this text, right? And, this is that distance. And that's basically being set up by the column. This is my first column, second column, and then the third column. And so if I can make my column wider and there's more space between my columns, or if I drag it closer, these get closer. Also note that typically when you have things inside of a table, they will defaultly sort of like align to the left. So once again, I'm still kind of getting that alignment. So it's like all my text here is kind of aligning to the left, at least by default. You can change that. So if I wanted to, I could do something like this, where I take this and I change the alignment to the right side. So it's no longer being aligned, but this is a way to control both the alignment of items and also the distance from the items based on the width or the height of my columns or the height of my rows. So these are columns, these would be my rows, and I can actually increase the height to make a vertical. And if I was to take all of these and place them at the top, I'm changing the space between these. Okay. All right, so let's see how this would actually come into play in CSS. So before we do anything, I just want to show an example. So inside exercise 3, I want to show a little PDF. Okay. This is what we're going to be building. Okay, it's a 2-column layout where the first column is very thin and the second column is very wide. Okay, so to go back to here, essentially think of it like this, like if this was my first column and this was my second column, it's going to be something that kind of looks like this, give or take. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is let's go inside of this is my exercise, and let's go to my HTML. Now, before we can do a CSS grid, we have to make sure our CSS is set up in a particular way. Okay, so the way it works is that, notice here that I have a bunch of sections, right? Or some sort of container tag. Each container tag has different information about a comedian, and they're all inside of this div tag. Okay, now we talked about having this container div. Well, there's this container div that goes around all of my sections. Okay, the thing about this is when you do a CSS grid, the containers here have to be a direct child of this, which means like this can't be inside something else. It's like this is the parent to this, to all of these, right? So inside of this, each one of these sections is a child of this container div that I've created. Okay. Now let's just preview this and see what it looks like. And so right now I have basically I have a one column where the text goes all the way from the left side of the page all the way to the right side of the page. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to turn this into a 2-column layout that's kind of like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this, I want to turn the container that everything is inside of, or the parent container, which in this case is my div with the class of container applied to it. And I want to turn it into a grid. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, remember how a couple modules ago, I talked about using display to change an inline into a block, or a block into an inline, or you could turn it into an inline block. There's actually a lot of things you can turn. We can use the display to basically change the default way your browser renders something. So not only can I change that block into an inline or an inline to block, I can also turn this div tag and make it work like a grid. So what I'm going to do is say display grid. Okay. I'm going to save and I'm going to refresh. Oops. It's not going to really change anything yet. Okay. Now, the reason why nothing happened is I say that I have a grid, and grids have rows and columns. Okay. But the problem is I didn't tell it how many columns or how many rows I have. So it didn't know what to do, and that's why it hasn't really done anything. Okay. What I'm going to do is, once again, you have to apply this to the container that's the parent of everything. I want to tell the browser how many columns I have. Okay, and the way I can do that is by using this CSS property called grid template columns. What this does is it will tell the parent how many columns there are, and then each item will then conform to that many number of columns. So the way I like to think of it is like, think of this as like silly, this is like Play-Doh. You know how like, how do I explain it? The way I like to kind of think of this, you know, there was like this kind of like Play-Doh fun shape maker. And essentially the way that it worked, I don't even know what I'm looking at here, what website this is, but you remember how like in the Play-Doh, it's like if you put this here or this there, it would change the shape of what comes out. The Play-Doh is the same, but it changes the form. That's kind of like what we're doing here. The template will tell it how many columns there'll be, and all of this content will be rearranged to meet that number of columns. Okay, I know that sounds a bit odd right now, but just follow me here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say grid template columns 400 pixels. Okay, what that means is we are making one column that is 400 pixels wide. So if I go back and let's refresh, this has now become 400 pixels. Okay, but I don't want one column, I want 2 columns. So what I'm going to do is say 800 pixels. So what this is saying basically is I'm going to have 2 columns. This is my first column, and this is going to be my second column. My first column is going to be 400 pixels wide, and my second column is going to be 800 pixels wide. Then what's going to happen is it's going to say, okay, well, we have 6 table cells. So the first, this is going to go here, this is going to go there. This is going to go here because it has to go back to the next line. This is going to go there. This is going to go here. This is going to go there. Or in other words, I'm going to have 2 columns and end up with 3 rows because I have 6 table cells. And so I end up looking like this. Okay. So I have 2 columns. First column is 400 pixels. The second column is 800 pixels. Okay. What I'm going to do is, now that we're starting to play around with grids, we may want to look at our grids in our browser. Okay. So many browsers like Chrome and Firefox and some of the newer ones, like the more updated version of Safari, they have tools that actually let you look at the grid and the settings of your grid. Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually right click here in Chrome, And I'm going to go to where it says inspect. Another way you can do this is going under view, developer, and then inspect elements. Either way would work. I just right click, do this because I'm quick and easy. Now, when you look at your page, you can tell if there's a grid being applied because in your code, and if you're in the elements, which shows you all of your HTML, there should be a little gray pill that says grid. Okay, that means that this container has a grid being applied to it. And what will happen is if you click on that grid, it literally will show you the grid lines. Okay, so it's like you can't see them because they're invisible, kind of like, you know, if I could sort of show this out, it's like you don't see these lines, are sort of invisible, but it's like here it's like, okay, this is my first column, this is my second column, and it actually will give you information about your grid. So I can see here that there it says 400 pixels and then 800. Well, that's the width. So my first column is 400, my second column is 800. Okay, you want a little more information about your grid. Well, typically there's an area called layout. It depends which browser you have, whether you're dealing with Chrome or Firefox, where it is. If it's Chrome, it just kind of shows up under, when you highlight this, it should show up. In Firefox, it's a slightly different location, but this is actually my grid information. So I can actually see, these are my dimensions. These show me the lines. And this is actually my color. So right now it's defaulting to this kind of orangey color. If I wanted it to be a different color, I could click here and make that like blue. Now, if you don't want to see it anymore, just click off of it and it goes away. Or just close out your inspect. Either way, it should close it out. Okay. All right. Let's do another one. I want to make something that looks like this. Okay. There's a bunch of tech companies, and what I want to do is I want to set up a 2-column layout where each column takes up 50% of the page. And then I want to easily change it so that rather than taking up 50% of the page, each column takes up about a third, or 33.3% of the page. Okay. So once again, I'm going to just look at exercise 4 here. And let's just look at the HTML before I do anything. So I have a bunch of tech companies. Each one is inside of a section tag. It's important that your HTML is set up correctly. That's why we're spending time to look at it before we do anything. So I have 6 sections, and they're all inside of this div. Okay, so the div is the parent container. All right, so let's preview this. All right, there you go. And I want to make this into a 2-column layout. So let's say, okay, I'm going to take the container and we're going to use display grid. Now, once again, grid by itself doesn't do anything, or doesn't do very much, because it doesn't know how many columns we want. So in order to set up our columns, we have to say grid template columns. Now, for now, I said I wanted them to be about 50%, 50%. So let's set them up to be 500 pixels, 500 pixels. This would be the width of my first one. This would be the width of my second one. And you can see now that, you know, there's 50%, 50%. But the problem is that, well, what if I make my page bigger? Well, now this isn't 50%, 50% anymore, because this is 500 and this is 500, but I have all this dead space here. So it kind of makes this look longer. Or what if I did it like this, with the pages like this? And so now it's not really 50%, 50%. This is like 75 and this is 25 or something like that. So instead of using a finite number like 500 pixels, we may want to use a percentage. Okay. So instead of using something like 500, I could use 50%. 50%. What this would mean is, well, this is my first column and it's 50% of the, you know, whatever size your container is, it's going to be 50% of that. This means whatever your second column is going to be, it's going to be 50% of whatever the column or whatever the container is. Okay. So let's save and preview. All right, so this is now 50%, 50%. How do I know it's 50%? Well, if I resize this, you can see it's growing or shrinking. Okay, this is the start of something we're going to talk about much later in the course, which is this idea of responsive design, or a design that can update depending on the size of our web page. Okay, we'll get way more into this later, so don't worry that I'm kind of breezing past this, because we will talk about it in depth later. But for now, it's like, isn't that kind of interesting how quickly and easily we could kind of make this into 2 columns, you know? Now, I said before, it's like, okay, I want 2 columns, right? Let's go back and look at that PDF. So I have my 2 columns like I wanted, but now I want to quickly change it to 3 columns, right? Well, what's really setting the number of columns is this. So right now, 50% plus 50% equals 100%, or the whole width of the page. So if I wanted to have 3 columns and I want the columns to be equal size, well, they should each be 33. 33 plus 33 plus 33 is, technically it's 99. It should be 33 and a third, or 33.33% is 1/3. Make sure there's spaces between this, by the way. So what this means is that my first column will be 1/3 of the page horizontally, second will be 1/3, and then the last one will be 1/3. Okay. So now look how quickly and easily I changed that from 2 columns to 3 columns, just by changing the percentage. By the way, I know I made them all equal amounts. They don't have to be equal amounts. I could make this 25%, 25%, 50%. So this will be 1/4 of the page, 1/4 of the page. The second will be 1/4 of the page, and the last one will be 50% of the page. And then, okay. So as long, you can make them whatever divisions you want. You just typically don't want them to be greater than 100% of the page, because then it's bigger than the page, and that's going to cause problems. Okay. All right, last thing I'm going to talk about in this video, and then you should try this out, is I'm going to go to exercise 5. Let's look at this. All right, so I have a 2-column layout here. And notice that each has a different height, okay, of the row. So let's go back to, this, and it's like, well, like I said, it's like I can change the height here to make the height of my rows taller or shorter. And by doing that, I put more space between items, right? So we can do that. So what I'm going to do, this is exercise 5. It's about different famous scientists throughout the history. What I'm going to do is, once again, just let's look through the CSS, or sorry, the HTML real quick. It's a bunch of section tags, right? And they're all inside of this parent tag called this div that has a class called container on it. And what I'm going to do is, let's say container, and let's set it into a 2-column layout. So grid, display grid, and then grid template columns. And I'm just going to set it into a 2-column layout that's about 50%, 50%. Okay. So that's a 2-column layout, 1, 2, and you can see that it's based on percentages because it reorders itself depending on the size of my web page. But I want to change their height. Okay. Well, before we were playing around with the width of our column by using the grid template columns, I can also play around with the height of things using just grid template rows. And I can actually state the height that I want things to be. So I'm going to say 200 pixels, 400 pixels, 300 pixels. What this means is this is going to be the height of my first row, if there is one. This is going to be the height of my second row, if there is one. And this is going to be the height of my third row, if there is one. Okay. So it should go, if I refresh this, you can see this is 200, this is 400, so it's much taller than this one is. And this is 300. Okay, so you can see here that we can play around with setting up dimensions of things by playing around with how many columns there are and how, what is the width of each column, and also how many, how many rows do we have and what is the height of those rows.